Today we bring you bone-chilling encounters with nature's most fearsome predators. These accounts reveal the split-second decisions that meant life or death when facing grizzlies, black bears, and Kodiak bears. From surprise attacks on hiking trails to desperate survival in remote wilderness, you'll witness 6 harrowing stories where ordinary people faced the unimaginable. Join us as we document these terrifying bear encounters and the lessons learned when humans cross paths with these powerful animals. The pale dawn light shimmered over the cold, fast-moving river that wound through the forests of British Columbia, where 7 teenage scouts and 2 adult leaders began crossing the waist-deep water on the morning of June 9, 2025. Their breath fogged in the chilly air as they held their packs above their heads, boots slipping on slick river rocks. It was the 3rd day of a backcountry expedition, remote, beautiful, and now quietly dangerous. 12-year-old Ethan stumbled on a submerged boulder, sending ripples across the surface. 15-year-old Daniel, just ahead, glanced back, uneasy. They had camped along the river the night before, but their adult leaders, Mr. Collins and Ms. Ramirez, both experienced yet increasingly complacent, had failed to enforce strict food protocols. Scraps from dinner and an improvised latrine too close to the water's edge had left behind a lingering, greasy scent. From the far bank, a grizzly bear emerged silently from the trees. Its heavy frame moved with purpose, fur darkened by dew, eyes fixed on the splashing figures in the water. Drawn by the scent of human food, the animal stepped forward and let out a low huff that echoed across the river. Panic swept the group. Scouts turned midstream in confusion, their footing lost to the slick, algae-covered rocks and the current's relentless pull. 14-year-old Grace slipped and vanished beneath the foaming surface. She reappeared moments later, limp and face down, bouncing off a partially submerged log before drifting downstream in the current. Then came the bear's roar, a deafening, guttural blast as it charged into the river. Daniel screamed as the animal surged through the water toward the scattered scouts. He grabbed his friend Noah, trying to pull him onto a boulder near the river's center. But the bear was too fast. Its paw caught Noah's back with terrifying force, shredding his backpack and jacket, bright red trailing in the current. Noah collapsed forward into the water, barely conscious. Nearby, 13-year-old Mia screamed as the bear seized the strap of her pack, dragging her backward through the river. She kicked wildly, then slipped beneath the surface, bubbles bursting around her face before the water closed over her. On the bank, Ms. Ramirez finally raised the bear spray from her belt. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she flipped the safety cap and pulled the trigger. A bright orange cloud burst toward the bear's face, just as it reared up on its hind legs. The chemical mist clung to its wet fur, and the bear let out a furious bellow, pawing at its eyes and staggering sideways. Meanwhile, Grace's body continued to float downstream, eventually washing into a logjam in the shallows. 15-year-old Sarah, shaking so badly she could barely walk, waded through the water toward her, grabbing her friend's collar and hauling her to shore. She began chest compressions, tears mixing with river water on her face as she begged Grace to breathe. Back at the crossing, the remaining scouts scrambled toward the far bank. Mr. Collins shouted for them to stay together, but his voice cracked with fear. He helped pull Ethan to shore, the boy's left eye swollen shut from a rock strike during the chaos. Oliver, 14, tried to climb the bank but collapsed, his ankle broken and twisted at an unnatural angle. Noah lay face down, his back deeply lacerated, groaning weakly. Mia surfaced nearby, coughing and clutching her ribs, her arms scraped raw from underwater rocks. Daniel knelt beside her, eyes wide with shock. The bear's massive form rose from the water again, snarling, its eyes inflamed from the bear spray. It shook violently, spraying arcs of water through the air, claws digging into the rocky riverbed as it advanced, but then halted. The burning in its face and sinuses finally overtook its fury. With one final growl, it turned and retreated, crashing through the underbrush on the far side of the river. Ms. Ramirez dropped to her knees on the bank, fumbling through her soaked pack for the satellite emergency beacon. Her fingers slipped on the plastic as she activated the SOS signal, a blinking red light confirming the distress call had gone through. Mr. Collins moved from scout to scout, using spare shirts and rope to fashion makeshift bandages and slings. He tried to reassure them, but his own voice trembled. Sarah wept with relief as Grace finally sputtered and coughed up water, her eyes fluttering open in shock. She gripped Sarah's wrist with trembling fingers. The clouds darkened overhead as the group huddled together, bodies shivering from cold and fear, the air filled with the smell of wet moss, blood, and pepper spray. Minutes dragged into an hour. Finally, the distant thrum of rotor blades cut through the silence. A rescue helicopter descended through the mist, its orange fuselage a beacon of hope. Leaves and debris scattered under the rotor wash as paramedics sprinted from the open door, fanning out to assess the scene. The scouts were evacuated one by one, wrapped in blankets, their injuries stabilized as medics worked to keep them conscious and calm. Bloodied gauze wrapped around limbs and faces. Eyes wide and vacant, stared toward the trees where the bear had vanished. Later that week, park officials issued a formal statement. The bear had been food conditioned. Investigators found remnants of discarded packaging, burned foil, and improperly buried waste around the previous campsite. A latrine pit dug less than 50 feet from the river had also contributed to the scent trail. Rangers emphasized that strict adherence to backcountry hygiene and food protocols might have prevented the encounter altogether. The attack was deemed the most serious, non-fatal wildlife incident in the region's scouting history. All 9 survivors were eventually released from the hospital, carrying injuries that would take weeks, if not months, to fully heal. But the psychological scars were deeper. What had begun as a week of wilderness adventure had become a nightmarish reminder that in bear country, one careless decision can invite disaster, and that survival often hinges on the smallest of details. Jake Simmons had always felt most alive in the wilderness. He was drawn to the raw, untamed beauty of Alaska's Kodiak Island, where steep mountains rose from dense evergreen forests and clear streams ran thick with salmon fighting upstream. On the warm morning of July 2, 2015, Jake and his girlfriend, Marissa, a bright-eyed 29-year-old photographer with a deep respect for the wild, set out early to hike a game trail that followed a salmon-rich stream deep into the island's backcountry. The forest was quiet except for the rush of the stream and the occasional splash of fish leaping through the current. Their boots sank into patches of soft mud as the trail wound between thick alders and towering spruce. The scent of damp moss filled the air, and sunlight filtered through the canopy above, painting the ground in dappled gold. Birds flitted from branch to branch. Dragonflies hovered low over still pools. It felt like they were alone in another world. As the couple rounded a gentle bend where the trail came close to the water, the morning stillness shattered. Just ahead in the shallows, a hulking shape loomed, massive, dark, and alive. A Kodiak bear, easily 9 feet tall when standing, was hunched over the stream, tearing into a writhing salmon. Its claws flashed as it ripped into the fish, the scent of blood and wet fur rising thick in the warm air. Jake and Marissa froze in place. The bear's head lifted sharply, and for one harrowing moment, its small dark eyes locked with theirs. The look was direct, piercing, a predator assessing. Then it rose to its full height. Water streamed from its heavy coat as it bellowed a roar that shook the trees and sent birds screeching into the sky. Jake's heart slammed in his chest. Instinctively, he spread his arms wide and shouted, trying to appear larger, louder, anything to drive the bear back. Marissa fumbled at her belt for the bear spray, her hands shaking as she stared at the towering form across the stream. Without warning, the bear dropped to all fours and charged. It closed the 40-foot gap in seconds, massive paws pounding the earth with bone-shaking force. Marissa stumbled backward, clutching the spray, but Jake stood his ground. The last thing he saw was a blur of brown fur and open jaws before the bear hit him like a freight train, slamming him to the ground and knocking the air from his lungs. He hit the mossy forest floor hard, A deep, guttural growl filled his ears. The bear's claws raked across the straps of his backpack, cutting through fabric and skin alike. Jake screamed as pain lit up his back, blood spraying onto the ferns beside him. Then came the crushing pressure of the bear's jaws, clamping onto his upper chest. The pain was blinding. His arms flailed weakly, boots scraping against the earth as the bear shook him once, dislocating his shoulder with a sickening pop. Marissa screamed, a sharp cry of pure panic. She raised the canister and fired. A cloud of orange mist blasted into the bear's face. The animal recoiled, snarling, frothy saliva dripping from its jaws. It pawed at its muzzle, shaking its massive head as the burning spray stung its eyes and nose. With another furious growl, it staggered backward, gouging deep furrows in the ground with its claws, before it finally turned and crashed through the stream, disappearing into the trees. Silence returned to the forest, broken only by the gurgle of water and Marissa's sobs. She dropped the canister and collapsed beside Jake. His eyes were half open, staring at nothing. Blood bubbled from puncture wounds in his chest and neck. His lips parted, but no words came. She grabbed his face, begging him to hold on, but his breathing grew shallower until it stopped altogether. The light faded from his eyes. Marissa broke. She knelt there for long minutes, hands shaking, sobbing uncontrollably, her fingers slick with his blood. The forest around her blurred into a wash of green and gray. The stream burbled quietly beside them as if nothing had happened. The sky remained blue. The birds returned to their perches. But for Marissa, the world had stopped. Eventually, she forced herself to move. Her hand found the satellite phone in Jake's pack, and with trembling fingers, she dialed for help. Her voice cracked and broke as she choked out their location through waves of panic and grief. An hour later, the thump of helicopter blades echoed over the trees. A red rescue chopper descended into a nearby clearing. Rangers leapt out, scanning the area with weapons ready. But the bear was long gone. They found Marissa pale and in shock, clutching Jake's body. Paramedics checked for vital signs, but it was too late. They covered him with a silver emergency blanket before guiding Marissa into the helicopter. Once airborne, the Rangers gently explained what had likely happened. The bear had been defending a salmon cache, food it had worked hard to secure. In such cases, a bear can go from passive to violent in seconds if it feels its food is threatened. Despite Jake's effort to stand his ground, the bear's response was a tragic but instinctual reaction to a perceived threat. As the helicopter banked toward the coast, the forest fell away beneath them. The winding silver stream, the towering trees, the place where it had all happened. Marissa pressed her bloodied hand to the window, staring out at the land that had given her so many moments of wonder and taken the person she loved most. In the days that followed, wildlife officials reminded hikers to carry bear spray, avoid salmon runs during peak feeding hours, and steer clear of feeding sites at all costs. But for Marissa, no warning would ever be enough. Kodiak Island had changed her forever. The early morning sun cast long golden beams through the towering pines and spruces of Alberta's rugged backcountry as 22-year-old Josh Carter pedaled hard down a winding mountain trail on June 13, 2008. Known for his endurance and single-minded focus, Josh had trained for months to compete in the multi-stage endurance race that pushed riders across wild forests, sharp ridgelines, and deep river valleys. His lean frame hunched over the handlebars, sweat dampening his dark hair as tires sprayed gravel from beneath him. Earlier, spectators had cheered from overlooks, but now the forest swallowed the trail in silence. All that remained was the hum of gears, the crunch of tires, and the heavy rhythm of Josh's breath. As he rounded a bend in the trail, he came upon a fork he didn't recognize. There were no signs, no flags or markings. He hesitated, just for a second. Then he veered left onto what looked like a shortcut, but it wasn't. The overgrown path twisted into a tangle of brambles and fallen branches, an abandoned track long forgotten. The air felt suddenly still, the forest unnaturally quiet. Then came the sound, sharp and immediate, the crack of twigs ahead. Josh barely had time to lift his head before a massive grizzly bear exploded from the underbrush. It was impossibly fast. The bear's dense fur bristled in the sunlight, muscles surging as it charged directly at the rider. Startled by the whirring tires and foreign scent, the animal let out a thunderous growl that echoed through the trees. Josh had no time to escape. The bear slammed into him with devastating force. Man and bike crashed together into a tangle, flying off the trail and tumbling down a steep slope blanketed in pine needles and loose stone. Josh hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. Before he could move, the bear latched onto his backpack and dragged him deeper into the brush. Branches tore at his skin. Rocks cracked against his helmet and ribs. Dirt filled his mouth and eyes. The bear dragged him roughly through 20 yards of undergrowth before stopping near a cluster of boulders. Then came the bite. Agonizing pain erupted through Josh's body as the bear's teeth clamped down on his left calf, shredding muscle and skin with a precision that felt both terrifying and deliberate. His screams caught in his throat, but then something surfaced in his memory. Advice from backcountry survival training drilled into him long ago. Play dead. Through the searing pain, he forced his limbs to go limp, barely breathing. His heart hammered in his chest. The bear hovered over him, swiping with its claws and nudging him with its nose, testing for a response. Josh didn't move. Every second felt like an hour. He could hear the animal's breathing, deep, slow, rank with the smell of blood and earth. Above them on the ridge, the race continued. Several spectators had stopped to admire the view when they noticed a flurry of motion in the trees below. They saw the flash of a cyclist tumbling, the shape of something massive and brown. Then came the roar. Shouts broke out. One of them, a seasoned hunter named Tom, yanked open his backpack and pulled out a bear banger, a handheld explosive used to frighten bears. He lit the fuse and fired. A thunderous crack echoed through the valley like a gunshot. The bear jolted upright, eyes wide and disoriented. It snarled in confusion, swiping at the air. Then, with one last guttural huff, it turned and crashed through the woods, disappearing into the dense brush. The forest fell silent again. Josh lay still, blood soaking his torn pants, the shredded remains of his calf stinging like fire, but he was alive. Minutes later, he began crawling, each movement a blur of pain and adrenaline. He made it back to the trail and raised one shaking arm. Fellow riders, pale and wide-eyed, surrounded him and called for help. Josh's breathing was ragged, his left leg a mangled mess, his right wrist throbbing where he'd landed hard in the fall. But he was conscious and alert. Race medics arrived within 20 minutes, called in by radio. They quickly stabilized Josh, wrapping his leg and securing his wrist. A rescue helicopter hovered into view and lowered down, blades churning the treetops as paramedics rushed in. Josh was lifted aboard and flown to a nearby hospital. The diagnosis was serious. Deep lacerations across the left leg, a torn calf muscle that would require surgery and months of physical therapy, a fractured wrist, and dozens of scrapes and contusions. Doctors were stunned he had survived. Wildlife officials later surveyed the scene and found a half-eaten moose carcass near the site, likely the bear's recent kill. They concluded the animal had reacted aggressively when it perceived Josh's sudden arrival as a threat to its food. To the bear, this wasn't a race. It was defensive territory. Survival instinct triggered in an instant. Race officials acted quickly. The course was rerouted, and new safety measures were implemented, including mandatory bear spray for all riders and additional patrols along remote segments of the trail. A hard lesson had been learned. Even well-organized events must respect the unpredictability of the wilderness. As for Josh, recovery would take time. Months of physical rehab followed, but the memory of being dragged, bitten, and lying motionless beneath a grizzly's towering form would never fully fade. He still dreamed of the forest, but it had changed. What once represented challenge and freedom now carried weight. A reminder that nature, however beautiful, is never tamed. On the cool, misty morning of April 14th, 2025, Alicia Reynolds set out for her usual run along a winding nature trail bordering a quiet suburban neighborhood in northern Georgia. At 26, Alicia was an avid jogger, the kind who found peace in early mornings, when the world was still waking and the sky was streaked in pale pinks and soft blues. Her route followed a gentle path that threaded through dense stands of pine and oak, passing patches of wildflowers and undergrowth, alive with birdsong and the flutter of waking wings. Earbuds snug in her ears, Alicia slipped into rhythm, footfalls pounding the damp earth, breath steady, music washing over the quiet rustle of leaves. The air was fresh and sharp with the scent of dew and pine needles. She had taken this route dozens of times before. Occasionally, she encountered rabbits, squirrels, or the flash of a white-tailed deer, but always at a distance, always part of the expected rhythm of wild suburban mornings. But something unexpected had arrived in the night. A young black bear, likely a subadult male, about the size of a large dog, was rummaging through a toppled trash bin behind a nearby trailhead. Drawn by the scent of discarded food, the bear had followed the edge of the neighborhood until it found what it was looking for. Leftovers, fast food wrappers, and half-eaten scraps left unsecured. Dirt clung to its glossy black coat as it pawed through the debris, food conditioned and unafraid. This wasn't the cautious kind of wild animal that fled at the sound of humans. It was bold, hungry, and habituated to people, shaped not by wilderness, but by garbage. Alicia was rounding a bend in the trail when the bear appeared. She didn't hear the rustling leaves or the clatter of plastic. Her music drowned out everything but her own breath. The bear's head snapped up at the scent of her sweat and movement. It startled, then lunged. The impact was sudden. The bear's paw slammed into Alicia's right thigh, claws tearing through her running tights and raking deep into the muscle beneath. Her scream was barely audible through her earbuds before she lost her footing, slipping on the rain-slick earth and plunging down a steep embankment beside the trail. Gravity took over. She tumbled, arms flailing, body colliding with roots and rocks as she crashed through the undergrowth. She landed hard in a ravine tangled with ferns and wet leaves. Pain flared instantly. Her left wrist, twisted beneath her, had snapped, the fracture sharp and blinding. Mud smeared her cheek, her chest heaving as she gasped in shock. Above her, the bear hesitated, then followed. It descended cautiously, sniffing the air, paws crunching down into the ravine. It circled low to the ground, black eyes flicking toward her collapsed form with unsettling focus. Alicia didn't move, didn't breathe. Every instinct screamed to run, but she forced herself still. Play dead. Don't scream. Don't fight. She lay trembling, her face pressed to the cold ground, the pain in her leg and wrist pulsing with each heartbeat. The bear loomed closer, sniffing her hair, its breath hot and foul with the scent of rotting trash. She could feel the vibration of its steps through the earth beneath her. Minutes passed, each one an eternity. Then, a sound, distant at first. A quick burst of noise, sharp and mechanical, cutting through the stillness. Again and again. A cyclist had rounded the trail overhead, drawn by the faint sound of Alicia's scream, and spotted the tipped bin and rustling underbrush. Without hesitation, he reached for the CO2-powered bike horn strapped to his pack and blasted it repeatedly. The shrill alarm echoed through the ravine. The bear flinched. It reared back slightly, ears flat against its skull, head turning toward the sound. For a heartbeat, it held its position, eyes still locked on Alicia's crumpled figure. Then it turned, bounding back up the slope and vanishing into the trees. The rustle of brush faded behind it, swallowed by the misty forest. Alicia remained motionless, too shaken to rise. Only when the voices of rescuers called her name did she begin to cry. Paramedics reached her within 30 minutes. She was pale, weak, and visibly in shock. Blood seeped from 4 deep claw wounds down her thigh, the torn fabric of her leggings soaked through. Her wrist was swollen and crooked, already purpling with bruising. A mild concussion was later confirmed, the result of her fall and the trauma that followed. She was airlifted to the nearest hospital. That night, surgeons worked to clean and close the gashes in her leg. One wound had narrowly missed an artery. Her wrist was pinned with metal rods. There would be months of physical therapy to restore mobility and strength. The physical damage was significant, but it was the emotional weight that lingered. Wildlife officials launched an immediate investigation. Local reports confirmed that the bear had been seen dumpster diving in the area for weeks, knocking over bins, roaming through alleyways, and growing more comfortable around people. Food conditioned and emboldened, it had lost the healthy fear of humans that kept most wild bears distant. The community response was swift and divided. Some demanded the bear be trapped and euthanized. Others called for better coexistence measures. Experts emphasized that the true failure was human. Unsecured garbage, open compost bins, and lax enforcement of wildlife ordinances had created a situation where a wild animal was placed in conflict with people. Alicia had paid the price. Her attack ignited a wave of new initiatives. Bear-proof containers were distributed to nearby neighborhoods. Local ordinances were revised to include mandatory waste security zones along known wildlife corridors. Trail signage was updated with seasonal warnings and emergency guidance. Community outreach programs began educating residents about how simple actions, like locking a bin, can save both human and animal lives. Alicia's life changed that morning. The forest trail she had once run for peace and clarity now carried the scars of trauma. But over time, as her wounds healed and her strength returned, she began to speak out. Not just about what had happened to her, but about the fragile line where the suburbs meet the wild. She became an advocate for coexistence and accountability, working with local groups to promote better awareness of the risks that arise when development pushes into shrinking wild habitats. The bear that attacked her was never found, but its story, and hers, became a cautionary tale about the unseen consequences of human neglect. Alicia survived. She recovered, but she would never forget how quickly the quiet beauty of a morning run had turned into a fight for her life, and how a single unsecured trash bin had turned a bear into a threat. The dense shadowed forests of Russia's Ussuri Krai swallowed the last light of day as a 5-man police anti-poaching patrol made camp near a quiet riverbank on October 17, 2016. Their breath hung in the cold autumn air, curling into mist above a landscape both beautiful and unforgiving. For days, the unit had tracked signs of illegal hunting through the region's vast and tangled wilderness, an area infamous not only for its isolation, but also for the deadly predators that called it home. The officers set up their temporary camp between towering fir trees and the slow-moving river, choosing the secluded site as a place to rest before continuing at dawn. Despite the stillness of the evening, there was a tension in the air, an unease that even Captain Yuri Vetrov, a veteran of nearly 20 years with the Far East's Special Forest Patrol, couldn't shake. He barked quiet orders as they unpacked gear and built a small fire for warmth and a simple meal. Nearby, Sergeant Alina Morozova, calm and meticulous, set up the long-range radio. Timur, the youngest of the team at just 22, offered to take first watch. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and climbed a steep ridge above the camp, boots crunching softly over fallen leaves and loose soil. From the ridge, the forest stretched out in a darkened maze of trees and silence. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the woods were sinking into full night. Stars blinked into the sky, and a thin breeze stirred the branches above. Timur scanned the edge of the tree line, blinking to adjust his eyes in the fading light. Then something moved. A massive grizzly emerged from the brush below, its fur dark and matted with what looked like dried blood. The bear limped slightly, one front leg dragging, its movements sharp with pain and barely contained rage. Its wide head swiveled as it caught the scent of humans on the wind, nostrils flaring. The animal had almost certainly been wounded in a poacher's trap, its injury a festering source of pain that now fed into a terrifying aggression. Timur's breath caught. He shouted down a warning, voice sharp and echoing through the trees, but there was no time. The bear charged. The sound was deafening. Branches snapped like gunfire as the massive animal barreled downhill toward the camp. Captain Vetrov turned just in time to see it burst from the brush, but not in time to stop it. The bear hit him like a wrecking ball, its claws slashing deep into his chest and shoulders before he could raise his rifle. His scream, raw and unfiltered, pierced the night, echoing across the valley as he collapsed beneath the onslaught. Timur opened fire, but his rounds went wide, cracking through branches and echoing across the dark canopy. The bear spun toward the ridge, surging uphill with astonishing speed. It reached him in seconds. One enormous paw lashed out, tearing through Timur's pants and opening deep gashes along his thigh. He screamed and fell hard, blood already soaking through the fabric as he clawed his way behind a downed log. Back at camp, Sergeant Morozova grabbed the flare gun and fired upward. A red bloom burst in the night sky above the treetops, momentarily illuminating the chaos below. The bear roared again, enraged and undeterred. It swung toward her, jaws snapping, claws striking the earth as it pressed its assault. The patrol scattered, but the bear was relentless. One by one, it struck with terrifying force. 3 officers fell before it turned away. Battered bodies crumpled on the forest floor, their blood soaking into the cold earth beneath towering trees. Only Timur and Sergeant Morozova survived the attack. Timur, barely conscious, had dragged himself further behind cover. Morozova, bloodied and stumbling, clutched a rifle she hadn't had time to fire, and just as suddenly as it had arrived, the bear began to retreat, limping back into the shadows of the trees, its ragged breathing fading into the dark. When dawn broke, the forest was silent again. Eerily still. A rescue team arrived by helicopter hours later, guided by a broken transmission sent just before the attack. They found the camp in ruin, scattered gear and bloodstains marking the site of the struggle. The bodies of the fallen lay covered in their jackets. Timur and Morozova were rushed to a field hospital. Their survival was uncertain. Timur later described the bear as wounded, desperate, and in unrelenting pain. Its erratic behavior, he emphasized, was not the result of natural aggression, but of injury, almost certainly caused by human hands. The poacher's trap that maimed the bear had not just injured a wild animal, it had turned it into a volatile threat. Wildlife officials confirmed that a large rusted snare had been discovered nearby, along with signs of recent illegal activity. The bear's injured gait and blood-matted fur aligned with what they feared most, a trap that had backfired, driving a powerful apex predator into a blind rage. The attack was a grim illustration of what can happen when the balance between human interference and wild ecosystems collapses. Poaching in Ussuri Krai had long been a threat to biodiversity, endangering tigers, leopards, and bears, but rarely had its consequences become so immediately and viscerally clear. In the aftermath, regional authorities vowed to intensify anti-poaching operations. New patrol units were outfitted with thermal drones, upgraded communications gear, and reinforced emergency response protocols. Conservation groups pushed for stricter enforcement and heavier penalties for poaching activity within protected zones. The sacrifice of Captain Vetrov and his team underscored the high stakes of their mission, not just to protect wildlife, but to maintain the fragile equilibrium between humans and the wilderness that surrounds them. Their story served as a harrowing reminder that when animals are injured by cruelty and driven to desperation, even those trained to protect the land are not immune to its most fearsome inhabitants. The line between hunter and hunted had blurred, and in that shadowed forest, it had vanished entirely. On the overcast morning of September 12, 2021, Dr. Elena Markov picked her way through the damp undergrowth of southeastern Alaska's ancient rainforest. The air was cool and heavy with mist, and the forest, dominated by towering Sitka spruce trees, stood quiet and immense around her. At 38, Elena was an experienced botanist and ecologist, specializing in old-growth ecosystems. Her work involved long, solitary hikes into remote wilderness to catalog tree rings and collect data on climate and forest health. That morning, she was focused on reaching a grove rumored to contain some of the oldest living spruces in the region. The trail was hardly more than a suggestion. Overgrown and damp, the forest floor layered with moss, needles, and the sweet decay of fallen leaves. Elena moved carefully, her worn leather backpack shifting on her shoulders, her field notebook and GPS clipped securely to her belt. Only the distant caw of a raven and the soft patter of water dripping from the canopy broke the silence. Approaching a cluster of fallen logs blanketed in ferns and fungus, Elena noticed something odd. Freshly disturbed earth. The soil had been overturned and flattened in a broad, shallow depression. She knelt for a closer look, brushing away pine needles with the back of her glove. It was the kind of sight that would intrigue any field researcher. Except this wasn't a natural clearing. It was a bear's den. Hidden beneath the logs was the excavated shelter of a brown bear, either a resting site for a solitary male, or more dangerously, a nursery for a mother and cubs. Unaware of what she had just stumbled upon, Elena leaned in. A low, guttural growl shattered the stillness. She froze, eyes wide, heart pounding. In an instant, a massive brown bear burst from the den in a blur of fur and fury. It was huge, at least 800 pounds, with thick, dark fur and fierce, alert eyes. The bear surged forward, earth flying beneath its claws as it closed the distance in seconds. Elena's mind raced. Her training urged calm. Don't run. Make yourself look larger. Back away slowly. She raised her arms, stepping backward, her breath tight and shallow. But the bear's charge was unrelenting. With a deafening roar, the bear lashed out. Its massive paw struck her left shoulder, claws tearing through her jacket and raking deep into the muscle beneath. The impact sent her reeling, crashing into a nearby tree before tumbling down a small slope into a thicket of brush and brambles. Pain exploded through her body, sharp, burning pain in her shoulder, and a fresh jolt in her wrist as she landed hard on outstretched hands. Her notebook clutched instinctively to her chest. She curled into a protective ball, body trembling. The bear followed, its breathing heavy, nostrils flaring. It paced at the edge of the thicket, growling low, sniffing the air around her. Despite its aggression, it didn't immediately close in. Whether confused, territorial, or simply defensive, the bear hovered near, torn between continuing the assault and returning to its den. Elena stayed motionless, her pulse thundering in her ears. Her left arm throbbed, a fiery line of pain running from shoulder to elbow. Her right wrist was swelling rapidly, likely broken in the fall. She focused on keeping her breathing shallow, resisting the urge to flinch or cry out. Minutes dragged on. The bear circled once more, then finally turned and slowly disappeared into the trees, its growls fading with the distance. The silence returned, eerie and complete. Elena remained still, too shaken to rise. Blood trickled down her arm, mixing with dirt and fallen leaves. Her shoulder ached with each breath. Slowly, she began to crawl, inch by inch, back up toward the main trail. Every movement sent pain lancing through her wrist and shoulder, but adrenaline pushed her forward. She paused often to catch her breath, her body stiff with shock. When she finally reached the trail, she fumbled for the emergency beacon clipped to her backpack. Her voice shook as she radioed for help, but she kept it steady enough to relay her location. A search and rescue team arrived within 30 minutes. Paramedics made their way through the thick brush, their calm presence a lifeline as they assessed her injuries. Elena's jacket was soaked with blood. She was pale and trembling, but alert. The team stabilized her arm and shoulder and helped her onto a stretcher, guiding her to a waiting helicopter. At the regional hospital, doctors treated deep lacerations along her shoulder, a fractured left wrist, and multiple contusions. The bear's claws had narrowly missed major arteries, but the wounds required extensive cleaning and stitching. Immobilization and physical therapy would follow. Wildlife officers later inspected the site. The broken earth and overhanging logs left little doubt. It had been an active den, likely claimed by a male bear preparing for hibernation or a sow guarding cubs. Either way, Elena had unknowingly intruded into one of the most dangerous spaces in the wild, a bear's home during the vulnerable pre-hibernation period. Officials issued new advisories to research teams and recreational hikers alike. Watch for signs of disturbed ground, scat or digging. Avoid approaching logs and root balls, and always carry bear spray. In the weeks that followed, signage and outreach efforts increased in the area, urging greater caution as autumn progressed. For Elena, the experience was more than just a close call. It was a confrontation with the raw power of the wild she had dedicated her life to studying. The forest she once viewed as a quiet cathedral of ancient trees now held a more complicated memory, one of blood, breath, and the weight of a predator's presence. Still, she recovered, and as the weeks passed and her bones began to knit and her muscles regained strength, Elena returned to her work. But this time she did so with deeper reverence and caution. Her research continued, but with a renewed understanding that in the ancient stillness of the forest, survival is often determined not by knowledge alone, but by timing, instinct, and luck. Her story became a case study among scientific field teams, one that illustrated the fine line between scientific inquiry and personal risk, especially in a world where wild animals and humans increasingly cross paths. And though the scars on her shoulder would remain, they were reminders not of defeat, but of survival, and the lessons only the wilderness can teach.